So good evening, everyone. Good evening, Patrick. Thank you again so much for joining us. This is part two of Patrick's talk with us at the Metta Centre. Last time we had a really great talk and also some excellent questions that came through and some excellent answers from Patrick. So I'm really looking forward to another session today with Patrick. So today's talk is particularly on seeing and understanding. And of course, that is referring to insight, vipassanā, and specifically for Patrick with his practice, this insight is as understood in the Mahāsī Sayādaw lineage. So we have spoken previously, so you all probably know Patrick, but for those who are joining us today, just some information about Patrick. Patrick has practiced mindfulness meditation since 1977. And he's really traveled the world in terms of his practice as well as also his teachings as well. Most of his training has been in the insight meditation lineage of Mahāsī Sayādaw of Burma, which included also several years as a Buddhist monk. His main teachers were Sayadaw of Paṇḍita and John Hale. He also trained in the Diamond Sangha lineage of Zen, where his teachers have been Robert Aitken, Rōshi, and also Paul Maloney, Rōshi. And now Patrick is a full-time teacher of mindfulness meditation for over 20 years. So we are so grateful and lucky to have Patrick join us and share his wisdom with all of us today on the topic of seeing and understanding. So Patrick, over to you for the meditation and Dhamma talk.
Okay, how long do we meditate for?
That is totally up to you. So it could be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, however you feel. No, keeping in mind that about 8 o'clock we will stop for the talk. For the question and answers.
Okay, and 7 o'clock your time now?
Yes, it is.
And you want question and answer starting at 8?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hope that's not asking for too much.
We'll see what we can do.
Let's go with the flow and see. Thank you.
So let's compose ourselves for the meditation. The main thing is sit comfortably and relax. Keeping in mind that what we're going to do is to be aware. And if there's anyone among you who is currently not aware, please raise your hand. No hands raised. You are already aware. For example, are you right now sitting? Do you know you are sitting? We already know that. We already know that we are aware. So in meditation practice, we're not actually doing anything extra, except maybe one thing. We're remembering that we are aware. Because we do tend to forget. So we give ourselves something to be aware of. Let's call it the meditation object. And then we just breathe, relax, and be aware. Have you forgotten you are aware? Have you drifted off into thinking and forgotten that you are aware? Just remind yourself, I am already aware. There's nothing extra to do. Just notice, I am already aware. Have you forgotten? Just to remember, I am already aware. And as you remember, you might ask yourself, and what I am aware of, is it the same now as before? Or has it changed? Start to be interested in how the object of awareness changes. What's happening now in your awareness? Is it new? Is it different? Or is it the same as it was before? What's happening now? Is it the same? Or is it different? Have you forgotten your awareness? What happens when you remember it? I am already aware. There's nothing extra to do. But just notice, I am already aware. Okay, and coming out of that, start to maybe stretch a bit. Ease out any tension in your body. And we can start the talk if that's appropriate. Okay. So last time we were talking about how we practice toward insight, how we design a practice. And in particular, we were talking about it in terms of how this is done in the lineage of Mahāsī Sayādaw. And he talks about what in English is called noting, which means directly awareing. So when this practice that we just did, we noticed, well, I'm already aware. So when I start the meditation practice, I give myself something to aware, something to be aware of. Now, for Mahāsī, if you ask, well, what is it that we should directly aware? It's basically whatever arises in any of the six senses now. So his style of practice is very open. And what we do is we train ourselves to be continuously aware, which, as we've noticed in just a few minutes we were practicing, often involves remembering that we've lost our awareness. And of course, that remembering is mindfulness. Now, how mindfulness presents, how can I tell if I'm being mindful? Well, basically, mindfulness presents as the felt continuity of awareness. So let's say I'm aware, but then I forget my awareness and I drift off into thinking, and I don't know that I'm thinking. And then suddenly I realize, oh, I'm thinking I'm supposed to be meditating. So I've forgotten my awareness. And then I remember, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to be meditating. This discontinuity of awareness indicates weak mindfulness. But when the awareness is continuous and we really feel it, that's mindfulness. So mindfulness is awareness, but continuous awareness. Now, as mindfulness develops and as concentration develops, what happens is, ideally, we become sensitive to what we directly encounter in awareness firsthand and what we experience secondhand through concepts. And we begin to recognize that concepts in their very nature are secondhand because they are about what is actually happening, not what is actually happening. For example, my concepts about my meditation as opposed to the actual experience itself. So let's take meditation as an example. Have you ever had the sense as you're doing the meditation, have you ever felt, this isn't a good meditation tonight? It's pretty bad, really. Have you ever had that kind of thought when you've been meditating? Conversely, have you ever had the thought, oh, the meditation's going really well. I'm glad I came to this thing because this is great. Have you ever had that kind of thought? Now, you notice how preoccupied we are by these thoughts. You notice how we actually believe this. Oh, I'm having a bad night. Oh, I'm having a good night. But both these are concepts. They're not the actual meditation itself. They are concepts about the meditation, but they're not the actual meditation experience. Yet we tend to construct our reality around these concepts. So at the end of the meditation period, what sticks around for us is this sense that I have, oh, that was a good practice, that was a good session, or the sense of, oh, that was a bad session, rather than what actually happened during the session. So this is the world of concept. What we're training to do when we do meditation practice is to drop this world of concept and see experience as a flow of events. And these events are what the tradition calls in Pali dhammas, or in Sanskrit and English, dharmas. And dharmas are individual experienced events. So, for example, the experience of this in-breath now, the experience of this thought now, the experience of realizing, oh, I've just forgotten my meditation now. And you notice that by nature, they come and go. They arise and cease. Do you notice I was giving you hints? What you're experiencing now is different from what you were experiencing before. And of course, what we're doing is introducing what the Buddha calls anicca sanya, perception of impermanence. Now, the world of concept is very attractive to us because it appears to be permanent. Now, remembering that for the Buddha, permanent does not necessarily mean lasting forever and ever. It means lasting unchanged over time. So, for example, my sense of self. So I come to an online Dharma talk. I listen to it, it ends, and later on I talk about it with my friends. That's a pretty normal experience, isn't it? But you notice that the experience of listening to a Dharma talk is framed in terms of I. I'm the one who came here. I'm the one listening. I'm the one who leaves later on, and I'm the one who talks about it later on. In other words, we're creating a perception of someone who lasts unchanged over time. The person who turns up, who decides to attend the meeting, who actually turns up, who listens to it, who leaves, and later on talks about it with friends. And we assume this I is real. And we even act as if this I is more real than the talk itself. That how I responded to the talk is more significant than the experience of listening to the talk. And you notice that means that we've separated from the actual experience into a world of concepts about the experience. Is that making sense? If you've got any question, just demute and ask. Now, but the Buddha might ask, in all of this, is there a directly experienced first-hand event that corresponds to this I? Or when we pay attention, do we instead simply find a flow of changing experiences, hearing, feeling, responding, thinking, and so on, that when we add them all up in a concept, become attending a Dharma talk, quote unquote. Now, when we're not paying attention, the Dharma adventures of this I are more real than the actual experiences of hearing, feeling, responding, thinking, and so on. When we do pay attention, these actual felt experiences, these dharmas, are more real than the concepts we have woven around them. And so you notice in this practice, we're training ourselves to stay close to the ground of direct experience. And this is the discipline of the practice. And part of this, as this develops, is we're training ourselves to recognize the fact of change, that this event now is already turning into that event now. And you notice that all of this belongs to the world of the particular, the specific, the individual. This now is already changing into another this now. This is what the Buddha calls seeing. But you notice it's always confined to the particular, the specific, the individual. But when he talks about the arising of understanding, jnana, of insight, vipassanā, then it's no longer the specific, the particular, the individual. It expands into the universal. So it's not that this now is changing, which is my direct experience. It's the recognition that everything changes. So how do we make that transition from seeing to understanding? And this is what we're talking about tonight. And we talked about it last time. We presented it as a paradox, although some people weren't convinced that it's a paradox. Because the understanding of, for example, impermanence, the universal characteristic of impermanence, which for the Buddha is the entry into insight, isn't the conviction that everything, everywhere, every when is subject to change. Isn't this just another concept? So have we trained relentlessly to abandon the world of concept only to arrive at the world of concepts, albeit different concepts, these concepts approved of by the Buddha? So this is what we were talking about in terms of the paradox that we finished with last week. And now we're ready to move on. Any questions so far? Okay, I shall move on. So if we talk about the entry into insight, we're talking about a transition from the particular to the universal. And the Buddha talks about this in a number of discourses, but let's look at how he talks about this in the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta, because this is the root text of mindfulness practice. And we'll talk about it in terms of using body as meditation object. So he begins by saying that he summarizes the practice. He says, here a practitioner, surrendering longing and sorrow for the world, lives tracking body as body, ardent, clearly understanding and mindful. So tracking body as body. What does body as body mean? What he's getting at is he's referring to this as a direct first-hand connection to the physical experience. So this physical sensation is just this physical sensation. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not satisfying, it's not disappointing, it's not me, it's not mine. It's just hard, soft, moving, sharp, and so on. So this is the first-hand world of dharmas, where one sensation segues into another. So tracking body as body refers to cultivating mindfulness, maintaining continuity of awareness over time. Surrendering longing and sorrow for the world refers to the work of dropping again and again our slide into the world of concepts and the emotional entanglements and the responses that arise from taking this world of concepts as real and living within it rather than direct experience. So this is the basic practice that we've been talking about and that we've been doing. Now, at the end of the section of mindfulness of body, we come to the insight chorus. There are essentially 13 different modules in this discourse, each one of which describes one particular aspect of the practice. And after each one, the Buddha opens up into insight. Now, this is what he says at the end of the first section when he's talking about body as meditation object. He changes the language. He says, the practitioner lives tracking the nature of arising as body, or he lives tracking the nature of ceasing as body, or he lives tracking both the nature of arising and the nature of ceasing as body. Now you notice that the language has changed, and with it the practice has changed. At first, the practitioner is noting body. In other words, physical experience as it comes and goes, as it arises and ceases. Now, she's noting the nature of arising and ceasing as body. So what's going on? So as I'm practicing, I'm seeing that one event follows another, follows another, follows another. Now, when I do this, I focus on a particular event. Let's say breathing is the most common meditation object. But if I'm doing this, it doesn't mean that the rest of the world vanishes, does it? Well, most of the time, maybe if I'm in a very deep samadhi. So I'm tracking my breathing. But at the same time, I am aware of different sensations in my body. The sensations of sitting, maybe painful sensations. I can also hear sounds from outside. I can sense thoughts coming and going in my mind. So I'm aware of all of these, but they're not my meditation object. So in the language of Mahāsī Sayādaw, I am noting breathing, but at the same time, I'm noticing these background events, sensations, sounds, thoughts, and so on. Notice that noting is essentially active in its nature. It's the mind's reaching out to aware an object. Noticing is receptive in nature. The experience is coming to us. So we have a foreground, background structure. In the foreground of our awareness is my chosen meditation object. This is what I'm noting. In the background, I recognize sensations, sounds, thoughts, and so on. So there's a foreground, background structure in awareness. And sometimes it shifts. Let's say distraction. Let's say I'm following my meditation object, but in the background, I notice there's a few thoughts floating around. And then suddenly I realize that I'm lost in the thinking. Is this a familiar experience? Now, if you look at it from the structure of awareness, it means meditation object in the foreground, in the background, thinking. And then at some point, this happened. And what was in the background is now in the foreground. And what was in the foreground is going back to the background, and maybe he disappeared altogether. Does that make sense? And then you realize, oh, I'm thinking I'm supposed to be meditating, and then whoop, it comes back. So now the meditation object is in the foreground and the thinking is in the background. Is this a familiar kind of experience? And we can look at it in terms of this foreground-background shift, because there's always a foreground and there's always a background, or usually, in most cases. So what the Buddha is talking about here is a foreground-background shift. The practitioner lives tracking the nature of arising as body, or the nature of ceasing as body, or both the nature of arising and the nature of ceasing as body. In other words, he is describing a shift in the practice. At first, there's a meditation object. I'm tracking the meditation object. And I notice that it changes. The meditation object changes. The mind that's doing the meditation changes. The body that's doing the meditation changes. Experience is changing. So foreground, meditation object. Background, oh yes, and it's changing. What the Buddha is talking about here is when suddenly, whoop, there's a shift, and I realize actually what my meditation object is the fact of change itself. And it's happening to this, to my normal meditation object and to the various distractions. So foreground, background. At first, I'm tracking a meditation object and I notice that it changes. Tracking, I'm noting, I'm actively working on a meditation object and I'm noticing this is receptive. Oh yes, and things are changing. And at some point, what I'm noting is the fact of change. And I'm noticing it happens to this and it happens to that and it happens to something else. This is the entry into insight, in particular in terms of the perception of impermanence, which is the kind of the standard way that the Buddha talks about it. Any questions? This is can be a bit esoteric. In one's experience, this shift, first of all, is very subtle. Secondly, you can't actually make it happen. It happens when it happens. But it's not under our control. It's not part of the agenda. You can prepare for it by noticing the fact of change. And if you're doing any kind of insight meditation technique, you notice it's all about change. So Mahāsī Sayādaw, it's all about change, mostly focused on distraction. Oh, I'm distracted. Change. Come back to the meditation object. Change. Say in the Goenka method, it's all about scanning the body. Sensation, sensation, sensation. Boom, 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 boom. Change, 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 change. And other methods have work in different ways. But it's always insight meditation technique is always about noticing the fact of change. And then at some point, there's this shift and there's the recognition, oh, actually what I'm awareing is the fact of change itself. Now, this movement is so subtle that it can happen and the practitioner doesn't even notice that it's happened. It could be days, weeks, months afterwards that they're reflecting and they're thinking, the practice is different than it used to be. What is it? What's different? Ah, that's different. So don't try to make it happen, but just be interested in the fact of change and what you can see about it. Another way of looking at this is a movement between uniqueness and patterns in this foreground-background shift. So we start with the unique, the particularities of experience. So this right now and this right now did not happen before. It doesn't happen later. It only happens now, as this now. And you notice that this is the boot camp of the training. And at some point, if we track this over a period of time, what begins to emerge are the patterns. How the particularities of experience flow within certain patterns that are consistent over time. So just this in-breath, just this out-breath, just this movement, just this thought, the particular, the unique. And this, and seeing how each specific event changes, begins to challenge our perception of permanence and therefore our perception of sameness. For example, does today feel just like yesterday? Have you ever had that perception? This is the perception of sameness, and it represents the perception of identity. Why is today the same as yesterday? Because it's the day that I'm experiencing, and I'm the same. So there's a stability in this kind of normal everyday perception. It's the same thing popping up again and again. So this is our normal everyday perception of permanence, the same thing over and over. And the practice is designed to subvert this perception by drawing our attention to uniqueness. So we learn to pay very close attention to experience, pay attention to the particularities of it, the detail of it. And the more we do that, the more we notice that actually this now is unique. We have never experienced a day quite like this before, and we never will experience a day quite like this again. So we settle into seeing the uniqueness of this now. Now, as we do that, we begin to notice that there is a stability in experience, but it's not in the things themselves. It's not in what we are experiencing. It's in the patterns of movement of all of these experiences. It's what the Buddha calls their arising and their ceasing. So it's not that this experience now is the same. It isn't. It's new. It's unique. But there is a regularity in the patterns of its movements, in how it arises and ceases. And these patterns are dynamic, and they are fundamentally causal in their nature. And they show how one thing gives rise to another, gives rise to another, gives rise to another. In other words, it's not the irregularities of identity, of sameness, it's the regularities of causation, of conditionality. This, of course, we enter into the world of what the Buddha calls dependent arising. It's rather like the weather. So our experience of the weather right now, right here, is unique. But the patterns of hot and cold, wet and dry, night and day, they endlessly reproduce themselves. And this is what the Buddha is getting at when he talks about the nature of arising and the nature of ceasing. He's talking about the general patterns of experience. So we start by having the meditation object at the center. We're studying it. We are noticing its changes. And then at some point, there's this shift. And we realize that what we're actually looking at are the patterns of change as they appear and as they dance through this particular experience of our meditation object. And again, this shift is subtle, and it's not something we do. We do not do insight. Insight happens. Insight is not part of our agenda. It arrives, as it were, from outside as grace. We cannot make it happen. It just happens. Or alternatively, it does not happen. all we can do, quote unquote, is set up the conditions that make insight possible or even likely. The first time I heard about this was my old Zen teacher, Robert Aitken Rōshi. He used to say that meditation does not produce insight. Insight always comes about as an accident, but meditation makes us accident prone. That makes sense? Okay. So we start to recognize that what we're seeing isn't individual events that are creating certain patterns. We realize what we're seeing are the patterns themselves. And we recognize that these patterns are stable over time. So it's not that just this experience right now coming and going according to conditions. It's understanding that all experience comes and goes according to conditions. So we've moved from seeing this, the particular, to understanding all of these, which is the universal. And the Buddha talks about this understanding as inferential. He talks about, in Pali, it's anvaya jnana, understanding regarding inference. But it's important to recognize that inferential understanding does not mean thinking about. It's a felt recognition that while the individual events that come and go are unique, each event arises only in the present. The patterns that present each individual each individual event, these patterns are universal and they extend over time. So let's talk about impermanence. We begin with the event itself, this event right now. And we see that this event has a beginning and an end. And then we understand every event has a beginning and an end. And it becomes very obvious because if events did not begin, we would not experience anything. If events did not cease, nothing new would ever happen. So we start to recognize, there's a pattern of experience itself, a structure of experience itself that is constantly moving, it's constantly dancing. And it moves according to certain patterns. And the patterns themselves remain stable, while the individual events that make up these patterns come and go in bewildering profusion. So, for example, let's talk about a pattern that the Buddha talks about. He says, feeling, conditions, craving. Now, if you've studied dependent arising, you've probably heard of this one. It's considered very important, especially for meditators. Feeling, conditions, craving. Now, which feeling is he actually talking about? He's talking about this feeling now, this particular event now. And what does he mean by craving? This particular sense that I have to respond to this feeling right now. So I find craving when it appears to me as a sense of urgent necessity. I've got to do something. And I've got to do it now. I've got to have something. I've got to have it now. Let's say you're calmly minding your own business and meditating, and suddenly a thought pops up. And it's kind of there in the background. You're noticing it. You're not noting it. You're staying with the meditation object, but then you kind of notice that this thought, it's got a bit of a pull to it. And you realize, I've just got to finish this thought off, and then I can get back to the meditation. Have you ever had that relationship with thinking? I just got to finish this thought, and then I'll be able to meditate. This relationship is craving, this sense of urgent necessities. I've just got to do this. Then I'll be okay. I've just got to scratch, and then I can meditate. I've just got to move a bit, and then I can meditate. I've just got to change this, and then it'll be okay. Feeling, craving. Now you notice that all these are very different events, and they pop up in all sorts of different ways, but the pattern is exactly the same. We start to recognize the patterns. We start to realize, actually, that's what we're looking at. That's what we're tracking, the patterns. So insight emerges as the recognition of these patterns and of how they behave. And again, these patterns are causal. They are conditional. They bring into existence certain individual events and not others. So, for example, the conditionality between feeling and craving is a very interesting one. If there is craving, all instances of craving are brought into existence by feeling. There cannot be craving unless there's feeling. And if we look back, we can see that's where it started. It started in the feeling response. However, we can have feeling without craving. We can have feeling without becoming entangled in our feeling responses. So this particular relationship is of particular importance in Buddhist practice, because this is where we actually start to disentangle from craving and from the clinging that arises from craving. So this is a particularly important relationship. But you notice how there's space within it, in this particular relationship. Then you have other relationships in which there's less space. For example, the Buddha says contact conditions feeling, feeling conditions craving. Well, contact is the immediacy of experience, the moment when an experience arises. And the Buddha says when an experience arises, feeling is there. In other words, we're already responding. And that relationship is completely tight. You cannot have an experience without feeling. Even a Buddha, when he has an experience, he has feeling. It's locked in, that relationship. But the next relationship, feeling conditions craving, that's not locked in. That's deeply habitual. And we go through it again and again and again, but it's not compulsory. There is space there, so we can start to play with it. So we're starting to see the patterns of experience. We recognize that all of these patterns, what they all have in common is change. The universal characteristic of change. Now, we're not there. We cannot see every individual instance of change. But what we can see are the patterns of experience. The experience is structured in a certain way. Its feature is events come and go according to conditions. And we start to understand that. We're not seeing it, all of it, because we can only see what's happening right now. But we're understanding the opening up into the universal. And of course, with that understanding of the fact of change is the fact of dukkha, the fact that we can't control the universe, and not self, that there's no one here who's in charge. But we don't have time to go into all the detail about this. But the whole thing starts to open up. But where it opens from is this movement from the particular to the universal. And for the Buddha, the way he talks about it, what he emphasizes in particular is the perception of change. That, for him, that's the gateway. It's not the only gateway. People are different. Some people enter into this universality via dukkha, and some people enter via not self. It can happen in all sorts of ways. But change is the obvious one. So for most people, and it's the one that we can do something about, because we can structure our meditation practice to get us to see change, to recognize it, to notice it, to bring our attention toward it. So I often tell my students that as practitioners of insight, our job is to become connoisseurs of change. We really start to appreciate it and to recognize it in all of its different flavors, because this is a doorway into understanding. Okay, I think that's it. It's a bit dense for what to do. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. We do have some questions that have come through online. Some of them were sent to me privately, but also anyone who has any questions, you're welcome to put up your hand, unmute yourself, or you could also pop your questions into the chat. So, Patrick, we've got some questions and comments. Maybe I'll start first with the comment. We have someone commenting about this, and if you wanted to add anything, you can. Everything is changing. World turns as we age. Change is the constant in patterns or cyclical way.
And actually, as you get older, it becomes increasingly obvious.
Yeah.
When you're young, you can pretend it's not really happening. But as you get older, it kind of gets harder and harder.
And in the context of change, someone has asked, knowing change is quite a conventional knowledge. What makes it special in the insight practice?
It's the universality of it. Change is obvious. Like, if the Buddha says, look, I'll let you in on a secret, things change. And you say, yeah, so where's the secret? What the secret is, everything changes. Now, we resist that everything because if we admit it, the self disappears. Like, you think about self, identity. How does it make any kind of sense whatsoever to have a sense of identity that is subject to constant change? I have a sense of identity. I'm Patrick. I live here, by the way. I'm a Dharma teacher. I think you heard my biography. Decades ago, I did this and then I did that. You notice how all of that assumes the absence of change. I'm the same person who went off to Asia decades ago. I'm a Dharma teacher because I have been a Dharma teacher for over 20 years. I shall continue to be a Dharma teacher. You notice how all of that assumes the absence of change. But what if we don't make that assumption? What happens to Patrick, the Dharma teacher? What happens to Tina, the Dharma student? Where are they? And that is terrifying. So we resist that perception as much as possible. So it's very easy to say, yes, everything changes. But if we haven't been struck by existential anxiety, by the fact of change, we haven't really seen change, not the way the Buddha talks about it.
And is that then that resistance linked with dukkha, that suffering? And so perhaps the insight that you're referring to and what makes us different to just conventional knowledge is that impermanence or anicca is to be understood in the context of also anatta, so non-self, like what you were just talking about in terms of identity, and dukkha, suffering.
That's why they're all linked. So in the classic presentation of the development of insight, which Mahāsī Sayādaw bases his method on, this comes out of Theravada interpretation of what the Buddha was talking about, and how they developed it over the centuries. But basically, the idea is that as the understanding of change matures, what then emerges is dukkha, is pain. Now, keeping in mind change, impermanence, the word that gets translated in the very abstract term, impermanence, is anicca, where a is the negative prefix. Nicca in Pali, nitya in Sanskrit, means permanent, but in ordinary everyday language, it also means reliable. So let's say we know that in the modern world, the demands for energy, electric power, are just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. Let's say we're living in a nice modern city and the government says we've solved the problem of energy production. We can have carbon-free, limitless energy for the next 5,000 years. So you can all relax now. It doesn't matter how many devices you've got on, doesn't matter how much aircon or heating you're using, go for it. We now have a reliable energy supply. In other words, we have a permanent energy supply. But what if you're just starting to really relax about this, and suddenly something goes wrong and you realize, whoops, it's not reliable, is it? Everything crashes. So this is why the perception of impermanence segues into the perception of dukkha. When it goes deep enough, we can keep it at bay by assuring ourselves, no, I don't change. I'm seeing the perception of change very deeply in my meditation practice and in my daily life. I am seeing this. I, who doesn't change, am intimate with the perception of change. Then we haven't really seen change, not the way the Buddha's talking about. But when we recognize I'm subject to the change, that is terrifying, because basically we're faced with death. And we have to go through that death to get to the not self.
Great answer. Thank you. And on that point about non-self and change, we have another question. Where do the ethics components of the Eightfold Path come into this practice of deeply seeing change and non-self?
It comes in at the very foundation, because why does the Buddha think it's a good idea to be enlightened? In other words, to deeply see anicca, dukkha, anatta. He says, because if we do that, we will live more satisfying and fulfilling and authentic lives. We will suffer less, and those around us will suffer less. So ethics for the Buddha is all about, how do I live well and happily over the long term? That's the fundamental ethical problem for the Buddha. And for him, this means I can do that if I cultivate human flourishing. And for him, the ultimate of human flourishing is enlightenment. So the closer I move along the road, the path to enlightenment, the further I move along this path, the more I live well and happily. And if I'm living well and happily, then the people around me are going to be living well and happily, because I'm going to be treating them well, because that's what I would naturally do, because it's obvious thing to do, because they're just as caught up in this craziness of greed, hatred, and delusion, anicca, dukkha, anatta, as I am. So ethics is the foundation of the practice, in the sense that for the Buddha, ethics, ethical behavior is that behavior which cultivates harmony within oneself and within one's community. Which means, and if I'm doing that, then I can develop samadhi much more easily. As I develop samadhi, I develop insight. As I develop insight, then the barriers between myself and others drop away, and the ethical life develops. So ethics and practice go together. The Buddha was once asked, what is it that you teach? And he said, I teach two things. I teach wisdom, understanding, and I teach ethics. Interesting that he didn't mention meditation. But then he said, ethics and understanding go together like two hands. If you're going to wash your hands, you need both hands. If you've only got one, you can't clean them. So ethics and wisdom are like this. And I think meditation, he didn't say this, but I think meditation is the interface. It's this actual movement between them. So for the Buddha, ethics and wisdom always go together. Ethics and understanding always go together. If someone claims understanding, but they're living unethically, then they're mistaken. They don't have understanding, not the understanding that the Buddha is talking about. So ethics is really important. It's at the absolute center of the whole thing.
Hey, thank you, Patrick. Okay, and someone has said, all this talk of impermanence and suffering sounds a bit negative. Where is the light at the end of the tunnel?
Oh, there isn't any. It's all darkness. It's all gloominess. No, well, where was the light at the end of John Hale, who's one of my main teachers, he was berating me one day. He thought I was taking things far too heavily. And he said, it's about enlightenment. You're supposed to get lighter, not heavier. Basically, the deeper you go into the characteristics, the less seriously you take yourself, because there's no one there to be taken seriously. And in fact, I like to talk about the understanding of not self as basically Buddha's joke, where not self is the punchline. And one of the indicators that someone has understood not self is precisely that they do not take themselves seriously. If someone takes themselves very, very seriously, they haven't really got it. They haven't really understood not self. Because I think there's someone there to be taken seriously. Dharma is very, very important. It's probably the most important thing in human existence. It is so important. It's far too important to be taken seriously. And that's why I like to say to my students, when you meditate, play. Don't take it seriously. Play.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Okay, someone has said, thanks for sharing about the link between feeling and craving. So based on that, how do we deal with pain in meditation?
I recognize pain for what it actually is, which is, well, are we talking about physical pain or psychological pain? Let's talk about physical pain because it's simpler. So let's say I'm sitting, I'm holding the same posture, it starts to hurt. What to do? Well, I've got pain. How do I know that I have pain? What tells me that this sensation is painful as opposed to that sensation, which isn't? Well, the difference is aversion. For this sensation, there is aversion in the mind. Aversion is the movement, I don't like this. I want this to end. It's resistance. It's the hardening of the heart. I don't want this. Where we have aversion and we have sensation, we have pain. If you take away the aversion, we don't have pain. We just have sensation. So in the practice, what we do is, first of all, we note, we're directly aware whatever is predominant. Now, if it's a strong sensation, well, that becomes the meditation object. That we may notice that there's an agitation in the mind that's developing. Well, this is not the sensation. This is the aversion. This belongs to the psychology. This is the resistance to the sensation. And then this becomes the meditation object. So we're looking at the mind itself, not the sensation. And so sometimes it's possible to separate out the response of resistance, aversion, from the sensation. When that happens, pain disappears, which is very interesting. And then when we identify with the aversion one more time, back with pain again. So we can work with pain and notice that it's not as solid as we thought it was, that there's much more dynamic than we assumed, particularly with psychological pain. But of course, you've got to be sensible about it. You don't want to, in terms of physical pain, you don't want to damage the body. That's not a good idea. And in terms of psychological pain, you don't want to put yourself through something that you actually cannot handle, that you're not ready to handle. So you do have to be sensible about these things.
And speaking about noting, we do have some questions about that practice.
Mm-hmm.
So someone has asked, is noting a form of mental cognition? Is it the mind being aware of the mind?
Being aware, and sometimes it's being aware of the mind. Mind can aware itself. But it's basically the action of awareing. But the implication is that it's active. It's something that we choose to do. So if you ask, well, what is the basis of the meditation practice? It's essentially choice. The choice to aware now. Now, let's say we give ourselves a meditation object. Let's say it's the breathing. I say the breathing because it's the most common meditation object. So what is breathing meditation? It's the practice of choosing now to aware breath now. And the choice is renewed. I choose to aware now. And then I choose to aware now. And then I choose to aware now. And this is the work involved. So effort is the commitment to sustaining that choice over time. But the essence of it is the choice to aware now. Now, sometimes it's focused on to aware something in particular, like my meditation object. But sometimes it's just awareing whatever's here. Could be anything. And this is what we were getting at in the guided meditation when I talked about remember awareness. Oh, that's right, I'm aware. And it could be anything. But you notice that we're making a choice to aware. We're doing something. And that's the essence of the noting.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Someone online has asked a question. We do have a question here in person as well. So someone online has said, we can choose to be aware now, both on the meditation cushion and also throughout daily life.
Yeah. In the formal practice, we're getting to know how awareness works. But we do that so that when we leave the meditation practice, we can keep playing with it, because awareness is always happening. We are already aware. It's just a question of whether we remember that we're aware. Another way of looking at it, which I've just heard recently, which is very good, this comes from Sayadaw of Burma. It's awareness is like light. People often make this comparison. So let's say in this room, there is light. How do I know there is light? Because I can see what's coming up. In other words, the room is appearing to me. So awareness is like light. I don't see the light, but when there's light, I see the world. The world appears. Now, let's say I step into a dark room at night and I can't see anything. There's just darkness. What do I do? Click, turn on the light. Oh, everything's already here. This is the job of the meditator, just go and switch on the awareness. Oh, something's happening. And you notice that fundamentally, it doesn't matter what's happening, but, oh, there's something happening. And then we forget. And we get lost in our thoughts or obsessions or whatever. What to do? Go, click, switch on the light again. And the light will go off. Click, switch it on. That's all. That's all we've got to do, is just switch the light on. And in this particular image, what's pointed out is it doesn't matter how long the light lasts. Maybe it just lasts for a second or a millisecond. That's not our business. It doesn't matter. What matters is click, turn it on.
Very good. Thank you, Patrick. Okay, we have a question in the room.
Yeah, I just wrote it down to make it like easier.
She's prepared.
Because I was sitting here for ages, like, how do I like form this question? Like deleting it, putting it again, deleting it.
The floor is yours now.
I finally got it. So because I finally got how to put the questions together when he mentioned aversion, and I was like, oh, that's what it is. And so the question is, you could say I have an aversion to restlessness, boredom, purposelessness daily. I wake up every day and need to be busy and respond by eating snacks and food and cleaning and gardening and eating and watching shows, starting books and dropping them with no sense of satisfaction. I only feel satisfied on uni days when I'm here studying and learning things and doing my work. Apart from that, nothing seems to entertain me at all. So I just end up frustrated all day. So my question is, should I stop trying to keep myself busy doing this or that and just observe my own aversions and be aware of them?
I think as if you find yourself caught up in a pattern which is very strong and habitual, I would suggest begin by using your formal meditation practice as a way of examining that aversion. So you give yourself a period of time each day where you are totally free to just feel aversion. So you sit down, you relax, breathe, and just let the aversion come and just feel it. Where is it? Is it in the body? Is it in the mind? How does it appear? How do I know that I'm aversive? How do I know that I don't like this? Be interested in it, not trying to get rid of it and not condemning it as wrong or bad or whatever, but just being fully open to the actual experience of it. And of course, you'll start thinking about it. Drop the thinking and just feel it in particular in the body. And that can be a very satisfying, very interesting meditation practice. Now, in terms of what you're doing throughout the day, well, then you make strategic decisions. And this is where we come to practical everyday ethics. Like, how do I feel better if I give myself something kind of constructive or useful or satisfying to do? Then I'll do that. I'll keep myself busy doing that, because I've got to do something. So this feels genuinely more satisfying. So I'll do this. But when you come to meditate, you drop all that and you just surrender to the aversion. You just let yourself feel it, but be interested in it. And don't believe any thought you think about it, because any thought you think about it is about it. It's not it. That's the key to this practice. You want to get to the actual direct experience as it presents now, and drop everything else that gets in the way.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you for the questions. Another question, Patrick, about noting. In the context of noting, how do we practice letting go?
Oh. It's an interesting one. For a start, we can't actually do letting go. Letting go is something that happens. It's like insight. We can't actually make ourselves do it. We can't add it to the agenda. I don't know if you ever tried. Have you ever, when you've been caught up with thinking, for example, when you're meditating, have you ever instructed yourself firmly, now let go? Has it worked? Probably not. We let go. What do we let go of? We let go of what we don't want anymore. And how do we learn to not want what we're obsessed with? It's by actually seeing it in its true nature as anicca, dukkha, anatta. So letting go is what happens naturally as insight develops. And so it just happens naturally. Of course, things we are deeply, deeply attached to, it takes longer and more struggle for us to actually let them go. But the struggle is involved in just staying with the practice regardless. The mind rebels and the body rebels, and no, I don't want to do this. Don't make me let go. What are you doing? Stop. And we just let ourselves go through this. But when the chitta, when the mind and the heart ripened, at some point, it just stops.
Beautiful. Thank you, Patrick. Another question. What is the role of the jhanas in the practice of insight or vipassana?
Jhana is just a way of describing what happens to the chitta, to the heart mind, as concentration develops. So the jhanas map how what are the qualities of the mind that become predominant as the concentration develops. So regardless of what kind of meditation you do, that development proceeds. But there's different ways of developing samadhi, concentration or immersion or integration, and how the samadhi experience presents will be different depending on the kind of meditation that you do. So most people who talk about jhana talk about what's called appana samadhi, absorption concentration, where they're just absorbing into one thing only. So usually when people talk about jhana, they're talking about how the chitta, how the heart mind settles when it's just absorbed into one single thing. If you're doing insight meditation, you're not absorbing into one single thing. You're absorbing into the flow of experience over time. So you do also get the absorption, and the same factors are involved, but the experience of it is quite different. But then there's huge debates. Is that jhana? Is that not jhana? Is there one kind of jhana? Is there lots of jhanas? And it gets very complicated. I'm sure there's a PhD in there somewhere.
And perhaps the next question is also a PhD topic. I don't know. How much jhana is required for right samadhi in the Noble Eightfold Path?
In the Theravada tradition, in insight meditation, again, insight meditation, the degree of jhana that you need to attain the first stage of awakening is the first jhana. And the degree of jhana you need to attain the second stage of awakening is the second jhana, and so on. Hence, 4 jhanas, 4 stages of awakening. This is the classical Theravada orthodoxy way of looking at it. Basically, you need a goodly amount of concentration power, because otherwise you can't get deep enough. And this is a major barrier for meditators, especially in the modern world, because our minds are very, very disturbed. Especially, I mean, compared to the Buddhist time, they're ridiculously disturbed. And in modern, most modern Western society, I think, the level of disturbance is very deep. For example, in Australia, the level of disturbance is very deep. I teach in Malaysia, in Taiping, and I get people from Singapore and around Malaysia. And it's very interesting. As a population, these are, of course, all Chinese, mostly Chinese. A few Indians come in, but mostly Chinese. And it's very interesting that overall, they find samadhi a lot easier than people in Australia. Their chitters, their heart minds are a lot less disturbed. So the samadhi just comes much more naturally to them. But here in Australia, it's pretty hard because the degree of disturbance within internal disturbance is very high in our culture. So it's getting harder and harder.
Why do you think that may be?
One can only speculate, and this is my speculation. But I used to wonder this when I was in teaching in Malaysia. I looked at these people. I mean, they often very undisciplined. They walk out of the meditation hall and chat. Come back into the meditation hall, boom, they're back in. You know, I mean, Australian meditators, the whole retreat will be blasted if they talk like that. So I was quite interested, like, what is this? And I finally, my hypothesis, and it's only a very general hypothesis, is that I think that for a lot of Malaysian, Chinese, Buddhist people, when they look deeply into themselves, they feel fundamentally, I am not alone. But I think when a lot of Australians, when we look deeply into ourselves, we feel fundamentally, I am alone. And I think that makes a huge difference. We're much more atomized in this culture. Now, the old traditions have died. Christianity has died largely and hasn't really been replaced. So another way of looking at it is in Malaysia, you find people with saddha. And saddha isn't belief. It's not here. It's here. It's the heart. A sense of connection with community, family, Dharma, Buddha. It goes much deeper than that. And that holds people. And it makes it much easier to develop the meditation practice. I hope I haven't discouraged anyone.
No, not at all. Someone here suggested that maybe an answer is TikTok.
I'm sure these social media, and particularly the kind of psychological disturbances that social media can create, the obsession with one's image, clearly these things don't help.
Another question, Patrick. Sometimes joy and peace arises in the mind. In meditation, is that to be noted as well?
Oh, yeah. And it's the hardest to note because we just want to absorb into it. But no, you just note it. It too will pass. But what you find is that joy and peace will naturally arise much more often and more readily as the more the practice develops.
And just on your earlier answer about Chinese Malaysians, and whereas in Australia we may look inside as more of an individual, someone has asked, don't we need to have seclusion for insight? So being alone is a prerequisite.
So what was the question again? I missed it. Don't
we need to have seclusion for insight? Being alone is a requisite.
Depends what you mean by seclusion. If you ever read the book Cave in the Snow, the English woman who went off in Tibetan Buddhism and ended up living in this cave for months or years or whatever. It's a very interesting book. I forget her name.
Tenzin Palmo.
Yeah, I think so, Tenzin Palmo. But if you read the book, and, you know, she spends months and months in this cave, it was quite clear she was never alone. You know, she felt the presence of her teacher. She felt the presence of the Buddha. So to be physically alone is one thing, but to be psychologically alone is another. You can be in a crowd and be psychologically alone. It's that sense of psychological separation, which is makes it difficult. But when you feel a real connection with the world, with Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, however you put it, then you can spend time alone, and it's very peaceful and fruitful.
So alone, but not lonely. So that's distinction, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so someone has said Jitsuma Tenzin Palmo lived in the cave for 12 years, but she wasn't living only in the cave. There was a real sense of community. That's what she
said. Even in the cave, there was a real sense of community.
Yeah, incredible. Okay, one other question. I have heard that John Hale's work as a meditator is finished. He has reached the end, yet I can't find much materials about him. Any material that you can recommend?
There is none. He was completely obscure. There's only the memories of the people who knew him.
Wow. Would you like to share any stories? This is our last question, so if you wish to share any stories.
He was one of my, as I said, one of my main teachers, and he became a real friend. Can't think of any just offhand, but he okay. Last time we were together in Burma, we went to Chamea Yekta and in Rangoon with Sayadaw Ujjanaka, and he arrived a month before I did, and he ordained, and he went off into a branch monastery, and he stayed for the 3-month vasa. And so at the end of the vasa, so I'd been there 2 months, he came back to the main center and we met up, and he was on his way home, having practiced for 3 months, and he was just spent some days hanging out in the monastery. And I used to hang out with him, and as many people as possible did, because he was somehow very attractive. People just wanted to spend time with him. And one time I was having a chat with him, and I said, look, you know, in terms of this insight, the 3 characteristics, anicca, dukkha, anatta, it seems that I've drawn the short straw, because whenever I pay attention, all I can see is dukkha. And it's, you know, really getting it to be a drag. Am I stuck with this for my whole life, or does it change? And his response was very interesting. He said, it does change. And he talked about himself, his own experience, which is very unusual for John. He said, you know, for me, impermanence just passed me right by. But for many years, what was obvious to me was dukkha. But now, what's clearest is not self. And it suddenly hit me, that was the difference. That I'd noticed there was a difference, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But it's true that for many years, he was the personification of dukkha. Not that he was miserable, but that he felt the pain of samsara. And it was very vivid to him. And it came out in the way he presented himself and presented himself in the world. But when he came back from that last retreat, I realized that was what was different. It was like he wasn't there anymore. He disappeared. That was the difference. But it was very, very subtle. He just wasn't there.
Wow.
And it was clear that not self was now predominant for him.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Patrick. That was an incredible session. Can I invite you to close the session however you wish to, whether it's with a closing prayer, dedication of merits, or some word of encouragement for all of us?
Sorry, I was distracted by looking at a chat. What shall I do?
Very distracting. Hi, Patrick. It's really good to see you again. Not sure if you noticed. Last time we saw each other was in 2006, 18 years ago at the Nature Conference. You seem to have defied impermanence because you have barely changed.
I'm much fatter than I was. You can't see it from here. So what should I do now? You want me to?
Yes. So Patrick, I'd like to invite you for any way you wish to close the session with a dedication of merits, a closing prayer, or just some words of encouragement, however you like.
Let's try the dedication of merits. Now, when we talk about merits, what are we talking about? We're talking about punya, which means power, auspicious power, or power for good. And the basic idea is every action has power. And this is the teaching of karma. But some actions have turbocharged power for good. And this is punya. So the English word merit doesn't quite cut it, because especially the way it's used, it's like I can accumulate merits and I have a kind of merit bank account. And maybe I can have black marketing merits. I can buy and sell them on the stock exchange. But really what we're talking about is the power of our actions, and the practice of coming together and practicing together and listening to Dharma and questioning Dharma and thinking about Dharma and trying to apply Dharma to our lives. This is punya. It's very powerful. And it's very useful to recognize that power, to allow oneself to feel it, and then to take it out when you leave the meeting. And this is a power that can transform our lives. So it's very significant. So don't take it for granted, and use it wisely and well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And for those who are online, I have just shared a link to Patrick's website, as well as also if you would like to make a offer of dana, a gift of donation to Patrick. He hasn't asked for this, but I think that it would be really special and lovely for us to support Patrick, because he is a full-time Dharma teacher and he lives on dana. And so if anyone would like to make that gift, I would encourage you to do so. And the bank account details are in that link. And for those who are watching this on YouTube later, we'll also put that link in the description below. For those who are here in person, we will also give you that link and also share it on WhatsApp. So just want to make some short announcements. We have a number of really awesome events coming up that we're organising. This long weekend, we will be having a 9-day retreat at Blue Mountains, and it will go starting on Friday all the way until the following weekend on the Sunday. So we still have spots if you would like to attend. We also have a Bhutanese cultural festival on the 13th of April. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be in Parramatta. It's a one-day event. It's completely free. And we have Bhutanese performers, as well as also His Holiness Gangtan Tulku Rinpoche, who will be coming all the way from Bhutan for this very special event. We also are organising a pilgrimage to Sri Lanka at the end of the year. That's going to be pretty cool too, including a 10-day retreat at the monastery in Sri Lanka before the actual pilgrimage. So we have our regular sessions, Monday meditations, Tuesdays yoga, and Wednesdays these very special talks. You're all welcome to join. If you want to know more about what we do, check out our website, follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and also if you'd like to join our email list or WhatsApp group, you can as well. So many ways to be a part of this Metta Centre community. So thank you all so much for joining, and particularly thank you, Patrick. Not only did we get one talk from you, we got two. And it's been really, really powerful just hearing you speak so clearly about the Dhamma and the teachings. So thank you, and I hope to see you again real soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.